You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Tiffany Cruikshank. Our podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts, Rachel Land and Katya Barch, as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs. Welcome back. I am excited to be here again with Rachel to talk on hip mobility, which was a brilliant idea of hers that I'm really excited that she brought to the table. We've got lots of fun things to talk about. I'll let you kick it off, Rachel.
Yeah, cool. I think I just wanted to talk about hip mobility because it's one of these hot topics. I see it come up in social media all the time. And I know that yoga has a history, or yoga asana, in the West at least, has a history of glamorizing really high range of motion, especially in the hips and the spine. And I think there's a backlash happening against that these days with more people that are more in the functional movement world almost talking about less range of motion. And so I guess I just thought it would be an interesting topic to explore, given how strong people's opinions are and how divided they seem to be, to hopefully find a pathway through. Is extreme range of motion fantastic? Is extreme range of motion dangerous? Is there a middle pathway that we can tread? I thought it would be fertile grounds for conversation.
Yeah. I think it's a great topic for a lot of different reasons. I'm sure we'll hit on a bunch of interesting points. But I think one thing that's interesting about the hips is for those of us who are more flexible, I think for myself included, I can speak from my own personal experience. There was this sense of accomplishment, right, associated with which is not everyone's experience when they first come to yoga.
Mm-hmm. Some people have exactly the opposite.
Yeah, with the hip opening stuff. And I think for those who are really flexible, it can be that kind of natural tendency, that like teacher pleasing tendency, or wanting to do better, or always wanting to feel more or do more, or our human nature to want to keep going further.
And even maybe this association with being open, not just physically, but that representing something about us being open emotionally or mentally. I don't know, but there seems to be that connotation too.
Yeah, and also with a context of maybe being healthier, or maybe feeling better in their body because of that, which I think there's something to all of this, and I think hopefully we'll look at dispelling some of those myths in our conversation. So let's start by talking about what normal range of motion is, because I think this is really interesting. We talk a bit about this in the hip training.
And I remember this blowing my mind in the hip training the first time I did it, looking at the tables and what that's so low compared to what I was expecting normal to be, was my experience.
It's true. And I think one thing that's helpful to keep in mind first is that what we're looking at here, if you're looking in like an orthopedic textbook, or that's where I've extracted a lot of the values from. Even in different orthopedic textbooks, there are slightly different values. So I've taken a range in our manuals and put in that range, but really all it is they've taken a big chunk of people and measured their range of motion and just said somewhere in the middle is normal. So keep in mind, that's really all these ranges are telling us, but these kind of normal ranges give us an idea of what's kind of generally acceptable if you were to go into an orthopedist, or, if you were to go into a physical medicine doctor who was looking at your range of motion. These are generally accepted ranges. And so when we look at the first one, which is hip flexion, just bringing your thigh in toward your chest, and you have to keep in mind, I think if you've not thought about these numbers before, right? 0 would be lying flat in Shavasana. 90 degrees would be your thigh pointing straight up in the air. And when we're talking about hip range of motion, it's helpful to take the hamstrings out of it. So consider that hip flexion would be a bent knee, maybe supine, bringing the knee in toward your chest. And, the general normal range of motion for hip flexion is just 120 to 140 degrees. So again, 90 would be straight up. So that 140 would be about halfway, right? 140. So sorry, halfway from 90
From the
degrees to your
90.
chest.
And
And
180
obviously,
degrees would be the thigh bone through the torso somehow.
well, and it wouldn't even be possible, right? Because you've got a
Yeah.
rib cage.
Yeah.
So 180 wouldn't be possible unless you eliminated your rib cage.
Which let's not do. Let's not do for many reasons. Let's keep the rib
There's some
cage.
valuable organs in there I think we should probably keep. And you can imagine for someone who's pregnant, that would also be limited because now you've got a baby in the way there. But with flexion, 120 degrees. So if you take 90, right, that's a third of the way to that 180, right? 120 is 30 degrees more on top of that 90. I always like to break it down so you can visualize that in your head.
You've just lost a whole bunch of people who are like maths, numbers.
So 90 straight up, right? Add like 30 degrees to that and you're at 120. 120 to 140 is normal range of motion for hip flexion, which isn't necessarily putting your thigh on your belly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which immediately blows my mind because we think in teaching yoga, the hamstrings can be an obstacle. No problem. Just bend your knees. Just bend your knees and then you can bring your abdomen to your thighs. And that's simply not the case for lots of us.
Mm-hmm. So being able to get the belly on the thigh may or may not be a necessary thing. I do think for a lot of people, it is for most people pretty reasonable to assume that most people in a yoga class could get their thigh to their belly. It's not usually a range of motion that we struggle with a lot as a society unless that knee is straight.
Yeah, and then it's a whole different story.
When you straighten that knee, that normal range of motion is about 90 degrees there. So think about that. Supta Padangusthasana, you're on your back, drawing your leg in, and we're trying so desperately. I don't know about you, but in my 20s, I tried so desperately to get that shin all the way to my face.
Oh, yeah, the foot's got to touch the floor. Surely the foot has to touch the floor.
Touch the floor.
And I think this is the single most important range of motion that shapes people's expectations about yoga practice. There's the whole, I can't do yoga because I can't touch my toes, or I'm so tight because I can't fold in half and with straight legs bring my thighs, my abdomen to my thighs. That's the one that people always seem to associate with flexibility. And to tell people that normal range of motion finishes at about a right angle, in my experience, blows people's minds. And
with the leg straight.
Yeah, with the leg straight. And it really does reshape their perception of what they should be expecting their poor body to do.
And that's not to say now that more than that is bad. We'll get to that a little bit more because I do think it's a lot longer story. Like everything, there's context to things. But, what we're looking at is here like the baseline range of motion that's needed for a lot of our daily functions. We talk about functional range of motion, really that relates to what it is that you want to do in your day. If you're a ballerina, that's going to be a little different than a sprinter or than someone who sits at their desk all day and then maybe, wants to just be happy moving through their body and picking up their kids and going for walks. And, it depends. Do you sit on the ground to eat dinner at night? That might take a little more range of motion.
So I think I think most of us would hopefully think that more is not necessarily better for the average person who isn't a dancer, but less than normal range of motion hip flexion can actually be a really big deal because maybe we don't think about how much time we spend in hip flexion. We think about just sitting in a chair with the hips flexed to about 90 degrees, but getting into the chair and getting out of the chair require quite a bit more hip flexion. So if you're somebody who's had a hip replacement, for example, certain procedures, they'll ask you not to go past 90 degrees of hip flexion. And all of a sudden it creates these challenges that you would never anticipate. Like, how do I get onto my bed and up off my bed? How do I get down into a couch and back up? How do I get into a car or sit on the toilet and get back up off the toilet? All of those things require us to flex more than 90 degrees. So it's one of those things where maybe too much isn't good. I'm not sure, but too little can definitely interfere with daily functions that you probably don't even think about as requiring flexibility.
Yeah. And I think, when there are real limitations, the research does suggest that having limitations and significant, right? So we're talking about significant limitations now, that would be less, that would be a 90 degrees hip flexion would definitely be a limitation in hip flexion,
Mm.
however that's induced. But there is a association between limitations or mobility deficits and potentially pain or loss of function. Obviously, my ability to now control the joint properly through
Mm.
these kind of daily requirements, like you're talking about for hip flexion, we take for granted. We don't really think about, but then you think about something like Paschimottanasana or even Malasana. We kind of have the legs, they're more abducted there. But even for those people with hip replacements, that's definitely going to be a very deep range of motion for people. Now, that's not to say that these things are bad, right? I think there's a whole nother conversation we'll have as we continue about the importance of range of motion, but that, when we talk about deficits, we're really talking about significant limitations that are easy to find.
Mm.
It's not, I can't lay my belly on my thigh and pigeon.
Yeah.
It's not, I can't bring my shin to my face in Supta Panangustasana. So hip flexion is 120 to 140. Hip extension, this is one I think that people often struggle with too, is only 20 to 30 degrees. And, we do this one all the time in our teacher trainings because I love it, because we tend to kind of put those hip flexors as the main culprits of limitations.
Yeah. Oh, they're so tight. Oh, they're so tight. We got to stretch those things out.
And it's so hard. You've seen me do this a bunch, I'm sure. When we do this on teachers and our teacher trainings, we'll go through the whole group. And I'm always looking usually for like people who are athletic, runners, cyclists, because they're usually the biggest likelihood to have some actual tension there
Mm-hmm.
in this yoga teacher population. But even still, it's rare for me to find someone who has less than 20 degrees of hip extension, or even much more than 30 degrees of hip extension.
Mm.
It's a pretty tight window there that most people live in. Now, I think if you go outside of the yoga population and you're looking at runners and cyclists, you're definitely going to find some people with 10 degrees of hip extension. But
so if we're breaking it down for people visually, again, we're imagining somebody lying face down, lifting their thigh bone away from the floor. It's not going to lift very high, basically, to give you 20 or 30 degrees.
Thank you. I can always count on you for bringing me back. So when we do this test in the training, you're really pinning down their pelvis so that it's not going into their lower back. And that's kind of that's the big factor when we do these tests on people, is you want to be really looking at that one joint as much as possible and trying to negate any compensation that tends to happen in the lower back. So yeah, I mean, we take people who are, like super bendy, can put their feet on their head and back bends kind of people. And again, I've rarely seen people over maybe 35 degrees of hip extension there.
And even that looks really pretty amazing to see from the outside. It looks huge when yeah, I think so. Oh, yeah. When I know how my legs are.
And it just makes you realize that a lot of it really is happening in the back, and a lot of it is potentially our bony structure of our spine. And, obviously when we're newer to this practice, there's some soft tissue limitations to work through. But I think for most people who have been practicing for a while, that bony structure does play more of a role in those extreme ranges of motion, especially in the spine. Because I don't know about you, but, from my perspective, most people are either like a really bendy backbender or they're not. That doesn't really change. You can get deeper. That's not to say you can't make progress if that's your whole goal, right? Like you can make progress. I'm sure we can find some ways to work into your shoulders and maybe work into your hip flexors, but there's not a lot of wiggle room in these hip flexors.
Yeah.
The extension you're going to get isn't going to increase a lot.
And in terms of daily life, we use this plane of motion, say, as the back leg when we're walking or the back leg when we're running. So we've got to let the leg go behind us to some extent so that we can then take a step forward. And again, on the very other end of the spectrum, I worked with a client who was just pre 2 hip replacements, and she had less than 0 degrees of hip extension. So her hips were always in very slight flexion. It didn't go very far, only got to about 90 degrees of hip flexion. But extension, when she lay flat on her back, her thigh bones weren't even flat on the floor. And in terms of how that showed up in her walk, instead of being able to take a step forward and leave a leg behind her, she had to rock to one side and then swing a leg around, rock to the other side, swing a leg around. So it looked more like a sort of side to side waddle than a straight forward and back propulsion. But again, that's that extreme limitation. That's 0 degrees of hip extension. And most of us, unless we're heading into hip replacement, don't face that situation.
I love looking for that one in the airports because you can usually find someone with limited hip extension in their gait cycle. What ends up happening is they either start to, if it's just a little bit, usually lay into their lower back, or for people where it's really significantly limited, like you're saying, they start to rotate the pelvis and kind of swing the leg around to compensate for that. So there's more rotation happening. So there's compensation. Our body's brilliant. I mean,
that's exactly what I was thinking. Like, how clever are bodies that usually they don't even tell the brain, we're figuring this out. You want to go forward? Not a problem. We will make that happen for you. We don't even have to think about it. Bodies are amazing.
And I do want to plant one disclaimer because we are talking about hip replacements a bit. And it is, I think, a bigger topic. Just know that when you're working with someone with hip replacements, now you have an artificial joint. And so we're not usually looking, there are some exceptions to this. And I know there have been some examples of this in the yoga world. But for most people, their recommendation from their surgeon is to try and avoid extreme ranges of motion to prolong the life of their hip replacement. Because at some point, especially if they're younger when they get it, at some point they'll need to have another replacement done. And so what you're trying to do is prolong it as long as possible. And so, especially deep hip flexion and internal rotation are usually ones that people are avoiding. So just keep in mind that there's a whole another realm of information to talk about with people with hip replacements. So we're not looking to force them or push them back into a normal range of motion. So I think that brings us off topic a little bit to talk on hip replacement. I mean, I like mentioning it, obviously, but just know we're not including all the details of working with someone with hip replacements.
No, totally. I just like to kind of look at the examples at either end of the spectrum, but it is a whole different kettle of fish.
I agree. So abduction, 40 to 50 degrees.
What? What about side splits and Upavishta Konasana? It's
well, and keep in mind, remember that there is a lot of rotation in yoga postures. In yoga postures, it's usually not just one movement here, right? So abduction would be you're standing and your feet are turning forward, so there's no external rotation, and you're lifting your leg straight up to the side, or you're lying on your back and in Shavasana and taking the leg out to the side. So the idea here is that there's no rotation, which does make nice and wide, some middle splits, some external rotation happening there, and some flexion. So it is kind of changing things just a little bit. But abduction, remember, 40 to 50 degrees is only about halfway to 90. And I would say this one, in my experience, is the one most limited by bony structure. For people who have bony changes in the way that the head of the femur sits in the acetabulum, or the way that the acetabulum covers or over covers the femur there.
And we say bony changes, but it might be that nothing's changed and this was just how this person was born. This was the shape of their socket, the position, the angle, the depth of their socket. It's not necessarily that something's changed through the course of their life.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. Let's say bony differences. Because it's true. Some might be changing over the course of their life. Maybe some of it might be things that we're born with. There's a lot of mystery there that we just don't know. If we're looking at someone when they're 50, did it develop or was it always there? So, abduction, adduction, 20 to 30 degrees, which makes sense because we're not really pulling our leg across our midline very far usually.
And the other leg and the rest of the pelvis is going to be in the way at some point.
Yeah. And even 20 degrees, think about Gomukhasana. Like we've got a pretty good amount of adduction there, but we also have hip flexion and some external rotation. So we're asking a lot of our body, but that adduction makes it really challenging for people because it targets those outer hip muscles. um, and the IT band potentially.
Mm. Which for a lot of people are, they tend to be tight because it's just not a plane we spend a whole lot of time in. Even if we cross our legs, they're only adducting a small distance.
Yeah, and I always like to think about it too with those abductors and the IT band. It's a really important stabilizing system, right? We don't want to have a lot of bowing of our knees outward when we're going through our gait cycle. So that IT band there is like a rigid band of fascia that keeps everything integrated. So in some ways, especially if you're a runner or an athlete who runs a lot of any sort, I don't want a ton of range of motion there. And so you see this if you teach yoga for athletes. It's a pretty common one, Gomukhasana, to be one of the very most challenging postures probably
Mm-hmm.
for athletes, I think.
And I'm glad you mentioned the IT band because it is a question that comes up from people. How can I stretch my IT band, or my IT band's so tight? And I do think it's important that people understand its function is not to flop around, but to be this really strong and stable band. It shouldn't be crazy flexible. We want it to be able to glide freely with the surrounding structures. But yeah, I don't want my knees flopping around.
No. I remember when I lived in New York the first time, and at the time I was doing like third series Ashtanga at like 5 a.m. in the morning, where you start out and the third pose you do is foot behind your head pose. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah, I haven't done that since I was about 8. So I'm just imagining.
I was about 25 at the time, I think. And then I lived right near Central Park, and I started becoming obsessed with running in the park. And I just remember very clearly that change in my tissues as I was now running and doing all this extreme yoga. It was like it was like torture, but I had this robotic feeling of like, you're told you have to keep doing these, set sequences of things that are, it's a progression, or maybe it feels like it. Obviously, everyone has different interpretations of Ashtanga and how it works for them. But for me, I had this feeling of like, I had to keep going and progressing and doing these things, and I couldn't go back, right?
Yeah.
Like you can't go
always
backwards.
forwards, never backwards.
Yes. And for me, yoga in my 20s was very different than it is for me now in my 40s. I think um, its purpose, was really more about dedication and discipline, and now it's more about therapeutics. But I remember very clearly that feeling of just the tissues being so different with just that one added stimulus of running, not a ton, but pretty regularly.
I had the opposite experience where I was running for a few years just prior to my teacher training, and I sort of had to stop running to focus on yoga because I was running long distances and it took up a lot of time, and I didn't have time to do that and study for teacher training and do teacher training. And there was definitely an adjustment from, my body felt okay when I was running. My hips, the joints would hurt because I probably didn't have fantastic joint stability there. That's probably a longer story. But there was definitely an adjustment period where I felt initially worse from really laying in my flexibility and sitting really deep in poses, thinking that's what I needed to do to be advanced. And then I've kind of popped out the other side with a practice that's a lot more moderate and hopefully well balanced.
I know. I feel like there's so many different things to talk about here, but
well, we haven't finished range of motion yet. So we've done flexion, thigh bone forwards. We've done extension, thigh bone backwards. We've done abduction, taking the legs wide, and adduction, bringing the legs together or across the midline. So maybe we finish out the ranges of motion with rotation and then dive in further.
Yeah, I think that your tissues adapt to what you're doing is the point, right? And so when we look at these different ranges of motion, we have to take into context, and we have to be able to adapt. Our practice needs to be adaptable for that. So with the rotation, everyone loves to talk about rotation because we look at it so much in yoga. External rotation, normal range is 40 to 60 degrees.
So that's nowhere near lotus, for example.
No. So if you're lying on your back and you take your knee, you bend your knee right up over your hip there, external rotation is going to be turning my knee out and my foot in. You can't really see it on the video if you're watching on YouTube, but you can imagine internal rotation is taking my foot out So I'm trying to keep my knee right above my hip, right above my hip. If you can imagine lying on your back, knee right above your hip, shin parallel to the ground. And then as I take my foot inward, that's external rotation because my knee's pointing out. And as I take my foot outward, that's internal rotation because my knee is pointing inward there.
And the knee's
Thigh.
giving you a visual sign of what the thigh bone's doing.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So my thigh bone is what's rotating there. And I'm just using that. It makes it easy to measure though, because now I'm just measuring that angle of the shin. So 90 degrees would be being able to turn. So in figure 4, or sorry, thread the needle, either one you want to think of it there. As I bring my ankle to my knee there, I'm basically coming into almost 90 degrees of external rotation. Now I am kind of abducting the leg a little. It's very rarely one pure movement in yoga because there's usually several parts moving, but figure 4 is a great example of almost pure external rotation there. And, you know, if you're bringing that shin parallel to the front of your mat, which many people are, we're at about 90 degrees. So that's a lot of external rotation.
Yeah. And I think it's one of those things where when students have the expectation that their shin should be parallel to the front of their mat, they might proceed with a little bit more determination and a little bit less investigation. So I always find telling people what the normal range is kind of sets them free to go, well, what am I actually feeling? And where do I feel that? Am I feeling it in my knee as opposed to feeling it in the muscles that surround the hip? I just think giving people information sets them free to kind of explore as opposed to thinking about what the shape's meant to be from the outside, which might work for some people and probably won't work for others.
Well, and I think if you think about this connective tissue is like the casing for the muscles, right? It's the anatomy trains, if you're familiar with Tom Myers, or, you know, what really connects the muscles. The muscles just contractile tissue sitting in that connective tissue casing. And if we think about it from that model, we've got these specialized cells living in that connective tissue, responding to everything we do. So if we're running, if we're stretching, if we're strengthening, like physical, mechanical loading of the tissues is a stimulus that triggers the fibroblasts, which are cells in that connective tissue, to lay down more or less collagen. It kind of upregulates or downregulates the metabolism of the collagen, so either the breakdown or production. And so think about it this way. This connective tissue fabric is constantly being remodeled in response to demands. So if I think about it that way as an athlete, I come to my yoga practice, I shouldn't be expecting to look anything like the person who's not an athlete, because my connective tissue matrix has now adapted to meet the demands of my sport, hopefully in a healthy way. Now, of course, we run into extremes where maybe it becomes rigid or unable to kind of store elastic energy or elastic potential within it. There can be changes or scar tissue or adhesions. You know, we talk about all these different things that can happen in that fascial matrix. So there can be a point where it goes too far in either direction, but it's not fair. It's like comparing apples to oranges. If I'm looking at a runner in pigeon versus someone who doesn't do a lot of, maybe yoga is their exercise.
Yeah. And rather than imposing the shape on the outside on the runner, you'd be wanting them to think, what do I want my body to be adapted to? Do I want to keep running? Do I want it to continue to be adapted to meeting that load and keeping me strong and stable? I probably do. So going into the pose with the intention of, can I soften up some tension and allow my muscles to refresh, versus can I make my body make this shape because this is the correct shape and I need to progress. You know, I've got to be as efficient in my yoga practice as I am in my running. In my running, I want to go further. I want to go faster. I want to go more efficiently. Taking the athlete mindset to yoga can be problematic in that sense that it doesn't really have that linear progress for a lot of us.
Yeah, I think, you know, when we look at different people, whether we're looking at athletes or yogis, we always need to be really conscious of that context. And also the context of maybe their bony structure is different. We don't know. So the last one is internal rotation, and internal rotation is just 30 to 45 degrees. So again, if I have my knee over my hip with my shin parallel to the floor, I'm going to be taking my foot outwards, which will internally rotate my thigh bone, my femur there. And that 30 degrees would just be a third of the way to 90, right? So if you would never get to 90 would be pretty extreme.
I think I've seen it
Maybe someone
before,
can do
but
it
it
early.
was, I think, in Paul Grilly's Yoga Anatomy DVD, like somebody with
Oh, wow.
crazy high range of motion that he was showing as an example. But it looks weird.
It's a lot. Well, and maybe just for me because I have worked and worked and worked on internal rotation, and I can not get more than maybe 5 or 10 degrees. I'm lucky. Like if I don't work on it, I'll be at 5 degrees. If I work really hard on it with active and passive range of motion and mobility exercises, 10 10 is about as far as I can get. And my guess is based on my understanding of the body and my body in particular is for me, I think it probably is a bony structure thing because when I get to that end range of motion, and this is a good way of kind of figuring it out and understanding, there's not a feeling of stretch there for
Mm.
me. There's not a feeling of pain or pinching or limitations. It's just it.
You
It
just
doesn't go
stopped.
any further. It's just like, oh,
I always like the elbow as this example of having your arm out in front of you and just kind of flopping a little bit through the hand to lock out your elbow. And there's just a feeling of that's just it. That's just as
yeah.
far as the elbow goes.
It's
And
like,
the angle will be different for each of us. But yeah, maybe you feel a little stretch in the bicep, but that's just the end. That's just where it stops. So, can I ask you a question? External rotation, I see us using all the time. Like if we squat down with our knees wide or sit down on a chair and take a figure four sort of shape to put on socks or put on shoes. Where do we use internal rotation in our daily life?
mm. I, I have a skewed vision of this because I have very little internal rotation and it really doesn't limit me at
Mm.
all. I mean, I can do everything I need to within a yoga setting. I would say usually in a yoga setting, the biggest place it shows up for people is usually Supta Virasana because there
Mm.
is a little bit of internal rotation there. Now, obviously, there's quads that you have to deal with there, which is a big thing. For me, I think it's a little bit more of the internal rotation. If
So
you were
this
to
is
do like,
supine hero pose where we've got the knees bent and we're rolling the thighs in toward each other just enough that our heels can clear the outsides of our backside or the sides of our hips.
yes.
Mm.
So sitting in between the heels is creating that little bit of internal rotation there. And so for me, I actually, prefer saddle pose, which is the yin version of it where the knees are apart and the heels are kind of pretty close together. So we don't have that internal rotation. It helps me get a little more into the quads.
Mm.
Not that Virasana feels bad to me, but it just feels I don't
Stopped.
get the quads as much. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think just variety is good because you get emphasis on different quads with different thigh position. And that's always nice. Mix it up.
Well, and here's what I think is important to me is that whatever range of motion you have, you can control because
Mm.
it's not that helpful that someone can push me into a pose, right? The passive range of motion in my everyday life is only helpful when I'm passively coming into something. So, like okay, great, it helps me get into pigeon, but that doesn't really help me in my life
Or maybe
unless
you're
I can
bending over to
control
pick
that.
something up off the floor. So there's, gravity's pushing your torso down. But
Yeah.
you can see the applications being kind of limited for passive range of motion.
Yeah, for in our everyday life, as far as we're talking about functionality. So, to be able to control that movement is what's important. And when we look at that range of motion, as you know and are familiar with, the big thing we're looking for are those gaps between my passive and active range of motion. So
So
if I
let's
can come
define those
into
terms for people because I think there's a lot of talk on social media between the sort of functional movement world and the flexibility and stretching world, and they tend to demonize each other. Some people are saying passive range of motion is bad, it's dangerous, and the only good range of motion is active. And I suspect the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, but maybe we start by defining those terms for people.
Well, I mean, passive is basically just where you're passively laying in a pose. So, pigeon pose, I'm not using muscular effort there to come into it.
So you're using gravity or somebody's helping you or you're holding a foot with a strap, but you're not using the muscles to create or hold that position.
Exactly. Actually, what's probably a really easy example is figure four. So you're supine, you're on your back, you've got your right ankle on your left knee, You're grabbing around that left leg, the hamstrings or the shin, and you're drawing it in, right? So that would be our passive external rotation because I'm using my arms. I'm still using some muscular effort because my arms are pulling my leg in, but my legs are passive. They're not pulling themselves into that range of motion. Now, if I were to start in figure 4 and then actively engage my leg, let go of my arm and my left leg, so it's just my right leg that's bent into that external rotation. If I were to try and keep that and then extend the left leg out on the floor and remove my arms, then I'm actively holding that. So, it can be a fun thing to play with too, being able to come into active and passive range of motion and go between the two.
And they'll feel really different, and they'll probably look quite different as well.
Absolutely. And here's my, there's a lot of advocates for why we do passive range of motion. And I feel like we could do a whole nother episode on this, like around yin yoga and passive stretching, because it does get demonized a bit, but there's so many great uses for it. And so much great research around stretching, positive research around stretching, which is kind of changing the way the sports medicine world is viewing stretching. But when we look at this, in order to have active control of that range of motion, so this active range of motion, I have to have the passive range of motion. So if nothing more, the passive range of motion is great because it then allows me to actively control it. I think that the negativity here surrounds this idea that I think a lot of people who aren't familiar with yoga think of it as just stretching. Which again, there's a place for that. I think we have to understand like how and why we're using our yoga practices. But if you really look at more active yoga practices, there's a lot of active mobility and active range of motion and active control happening. And, and even more so if you take that lens to it, if I'm standing with my knee into my chest, I can hold it and pull it in, and that would be more passive hip flexion because my hands are pulling it in. Or I can engage the muscles, release my hands, and actually use my hip flexors to hold it in there. I could straighten the leg and make it even harder, right? You get the idea here. I could mobilize my hip joint into a circle and control it through all of those different ranges of motion. Or look at very specific ones. But that active range of motion is really what's collecting the neurologic information that's driving that control of the joint so that when I'm in that situation again, I'm prepared for it. And in the athletic communities, the idea is that I'm only prepared for what I've trained for. So I have to be, if you're working with an athlete with specific motions, you're preparing for those specific motions. But then this idea of cross training now is that we want to be prepared for other motions too, because, especially if you're moving, or like football is a good example. It's football season, like you got all sorts of different movements, usually cutting and turning and twisting and being, all impact, of course. But when we look at this, we want to be prepared for that. And life isn't just perfect angles. It's not perfect articulations, but we're reaching and grabbing things and bending and twisting. And, we want to be prepared for all of that because ultimately our body is made to support us. In all these different movements.
And even if you're not working with athletes, I work often with older adults. Before the winter, I will start training people to be prepared for slipping because that's likely to happen on icy surfaces or on snow. So I'll get them working their range of motion with one foot on sturdy footing and one foot on a blanket, for example, so that their nervous system and their body get used to that feeling of the ground not being solid underneath them and figuring out where they can go and feel safe and comfortable and where they can come back from. But you mentioned a gap between active and passive range of motion as being something that you're kind of looking for or investigating. Why is that so important for people?
It really comes back to that neurologic information. I want to be able to have that neurologic information to control and actively be able to articulate it. There's always going to be some gap, right? It's pretty rare that someone would be able to actively control every degree of their passive range of motion. But what we want to do is avoid big gaps. So that think about the hip flexion one. If someone was only able to control, maybe 90 degrees of hip flexion, we just talked about a lot of scenarios, active scenarios that go well beyond 90 degrees, where they could be in some awkward circumstances to, obviously with this, a lot of it is preventative, it's supportive. I like to think of all of these things in a positive way rather than, fear of hurting ourselves, really thinking about it as making our bodies stronger and more resilient and capable. And kind of erasing some of that fear. And so, we want to be prepared for all of this. And I always mention athletes because I think it's an interesting demographic to look at because it is often easier sometimes to break down movements and scenarios. But I think every human is an athlete to some degree, whether that's picking up your kids and carrying them out around all day, whether it's throwing a football, whether that's being able to, carry large loads of groceries out of your car all the way up your stairs, up 3 flights of stairs to your home, or whatever that might be, preventing falling, or we're all athletes in some realm. And, whether we're physically challenging and really pushing ourselves to the limit in those motions or not, it kind of, I think, depends on the person and then how we support the tissues and recover from those more physically challenging practices, whether that's yoga or something else. I think yoga is interesting because it can be used both as the challenge as well as the recovery mechanism. We might do more active, like on Yoga Medicine Online, we've got yoga conditioning, which are clearly more of a physical challenge in some sort. And then we have things like yin and restorative, which are really more recovery. And again, I think there's a longer discussion. Maybe we need to make a mental note of doing something on yin.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. But I love the way that you've highlighted yoga practice as being the challenge, also the source of recovery, and also for me, the source of exploration, because a lot of people who don't practice yoga only really get that kind of assessment when they see a physical therapist of, I wonder if I can, what happens if I, whereas our practice gives us so many opportunities to kind of notice those little details that so often in the busyness of daily life just escape our attention.
I love that you said that too, because I think sometimes people think of yoga as injuring them, and we know that can happen, of course.
Anything.
Discussion on injuries to come, but I think it also uncovers some of those blind spots, whether that's neurologic control, whether that's recovery and tissue hydration, whether that's circulation, whether that's cardiovascular, whatever that might be. It kind of uncovers, I think, some of those blind spots by challenging us in different ways, whether that be in balancing in a standing one-legged pose, whether that be our breath and our breath capacity. We know, I think what I love about yoga is there's so many different ways, different lenses to look at it through. But, I think it's interesting to be able to look at all of them in different ways.
And going back to that active range of motion, passive range of motion, and investigating the gap between the two, I sometimes get the feeling from what people saying again on social media that their solution is to decrease the passive range of motion. Whereas we're thinking of that as the sort of, this is 100% of where you can go. And instead of backing down to 80% in the assumption that will then make you safer, have your 100%, but make that gap a little bit smaller, be exploring ways that you can control that range of motion and feel your way into the positions that you can find your way to passively or accidentally. So increasing the active portion rather than decreasing the passive portion. Am I understanding you right?
Well, I think there's a lot of different opinions on this, and I have actually a few opinions on it. First off, there's not a lot of, I think in the orthopedic world, there is just a general idea that more range of motion isn't necessarily better. There is some research around hypermobility, which is usually a diagnosed condition with changes in how collagen is produced in the body, which is a hard one to compare it to people who don't have collagen production changes or genetic changes. But when there is hypermobility, usually one of the biggest issues is osteoarthritis. So that degeneration of the joint or the hip joint in this instance here. However, there's not a lot of research specifically on just regular humans who don't necessarily have genetic hypermobility tendencies, and how much is too much. There's not any rules or regulation on that. What I will say from my perspective, so, there's this one school of thought that, you know, all of that can be fine if you can actively control a majority of that range of motion. And I do think that's probably true. What I will say, though, from my own experience is that I do think there's something beneficial, whether it's a mindset or actually changing to potentially losing some of that extreme range of motion. I know for me, I've never felt better than when I really focused. There was a time, it was probably a dozen years ago now, when I had a back injury where I really focused on strength and really backed off of my range of motion where, I used to love I'd go into yin poses, but I'd go in like 100% and stay.
Yeah.
And then a lot of times feel awful too, but I kind of felt like this, I'm working through something. Like this is good, something's processing. But I will just say from my own experience, and I've seen this with patients and students that I've worked with as well, people that I've worked with for longer periods of time, is that if I can get away from this mindset that more is better and start to be okay with losing some of that range of motion and focusing on strength and shifting my mindset toward that, I've never felt better. And even now, like in my 40s, I feel much better than I did in my 20s with that kind of mindset.
And I've had exactly the same experience where when I was first introduced to yin before I did training in yin, I would do the same. I would always go as far as I could possibly go. And it felt quite luxurious in the moment. There was a sort of deliciousness to that depth of sensation, but I would be in fairly significant joint pain afterwards. And even the next day, it might hurt to walk a little bit. I think back, what was I doing? Whereas now if I'm going to practice yin, which I don't all that often, I'll often wear jeans so that the jeans remind me. It's a weird little trick, but the jeans remind me, oh, you don't have to go all the way. How does it feel if you stop here? And often if I slow it down and pay attention to the small details along the way, that's actually quite enough. It's enough information to kind of interest me. And I feel a hell of a lot better later. So I've also felt better from losing my extremes of range of motion and focusing a little bit more on joint stability and strength.
And it takes time. I mean, I know for me, I'm trying to think back. Like for me, I think it was a process of just focusing on strength. I know I have this question a lot from people who are more flexible, who will come to our yin trainings. And, we talk about backing off to like 60% of your stretch capacity, and people who are more flexible often don't feel anything there.
Yeah.
And I do remember early on that was how I felt too. For me, I think it was a process of both strengthening and changing the tissues as a result of that. Again, this collagen matrix is responding and listening and adjusting, again, over months and months. It's not an instant thing, although you might go for a run and feel something different after a run than before a run in a yin practice. But I think also it was recalibrating my expectations from going to that 100% and that endorphin fix, right? Because it really is, I think, a lot of an endorphin thing. We go deep. We're used to feeling it there. That's my capacity. That's what I'm supposed to do. Teacher pleasing, whatever it might be, whatever the reason is. But if I can back off, and I think for me, it was a long time ago now, I think there was a period of just being okay with not feeling a lot. But now,
and it being more about the stillness and the quiet.
Yeah. Because there's more to it, which again, I think we should talk about on another episode at some point. But I do think now I can go into these postures and not go deep and feel some really great, maybe it's more the subtleties now. Maybe it's that I have more balance between strength and mobility. But I do think, back to your question, I do think both are true. I do think if you are really flexible, increasing that active control of that range of motion can be very helpful, as well as potentially if you're already really flexible, like maybe you can just mark that off your list. Like I don't really need to do this anymore for
Yeah.
now. And I can just focus more of my time on the strength work and support and stability. And again, we'll talk on yin on another episode because I do think there's more than just range of motion to yin. There's some really
Oh,
cool stuff to
totally.
be had in that. But
But I guess this is why I wanted to start the conversation around normal range of motion and the context of daily activities. Because if you're not a sprinter, if you're not a dancer, if you don't need really high range of motion for your job, then it's worth thinking, what do I need it for? Like, where am I actually experiencing limitation in my daily life? And that would be what I would be interested in. What's stopping me feeling comfortable as I bend over or put my shoes on or, reach around to fetch something? Other than that, what do I need it for?
well, and I think pigeon's a great example too. Like people love to lay on pigeon and pigeon, lay on their thigh, right? Or
Mm,
have someone push on them and
mm,
like get deeper into pigeon. I know I used to love it. I loved someone pushing on my hips in pigeon. It felt great because I got some sensation. Um, but think about pigeon. Think about like when do I ever need that full hip flexion, full external rotation, like all of the things in my life. And if I continue to keep pushing myself into these deep range of motions, now I have a bigger gap potentially between what I can control and what I can't control.
mm,
And now I just have more to make up. So I think that's where both of those are correct. Like one, I can back up some of that passive range of motion and maybe focus more on strength, but I can also focus on closing the gap of the active and passive range of motion. So if, I've got my passive range of motion backs up and my active range of motion moves forward, I'm closing that gap on both ends. And so
mm.
this active range of motion allows us to be prepared. The end range of motion is oftentimes where we get injured. And so the idea is that training to actively control those end ranges of motion is really important for minimizing injury and also helping us be more functional in our lives, whether we're squatting or sitting or rotating or twisting or turning.
Slipping on
Um,
on an icy pavement.
exactly.
Mm,
It prepares us. Yeah.
mm. Yeah, I think that's a really nice place to wrap up the active and passive side of the conversation, because the reality is each of our demands of our lives vary. And so probably what we need varies, but thinking about looking for the places where the gap is really big between those two and finding ways to decrease it is probably helpful advice for anyone, regardless of what the starting point is and what the range of motion is. Just figuring out where the big differences are for you and working from there.
Mm-hmm.
So how much hip mobility is enough then? What have we wrapped up to?
I think it comes back down to what you said, the context of what do I need? Obviously we can look to those orthopedic models for, some semblance of normal and, anything that's outside of that or less than that would probably be something that you could really benefit from increasing range of motion for
Totally.
sure.
Yeah.
And even if you're kind of within that normal, a lot of them are kind of for a yoga person, a lot of us can go to that higher range of most of those ranges of motion. And so I'm looking at, if I'm at the high range of all of them and one of them's kind of at the low range, maybe that low range one is the one that I need to focus on to find more balance for me. I mean, I think in general, what it comes down to is the things that come easily to you maybe aren't the things you need to focus on, whether that's
Mm.
strength or mobility. Like you can probably check those off your list. The things that are challenging, like you start going from Digasana to tree pose, or I don't know, any kind of transition there where balance and strength become an issue. We try and go quickly through it to get through it. And
Get
those
it
are
over and
times
done with.
where we really want to slow down and control it and own it and feel that active control. Or, we love coming into pigeon if you're like me and you're good at it because you can just lay there and sleep for a little while. But maybe that's not the most helpful variation of an hip opener for you. And so, as a teacher in a group class, I always assume that if someone's in a different pose, that it's for a reason,
Mm.
and I welcome that. Obviously, there's a respectfulness, I think, as a student in a class to not doing something totally different than what the teacher's doing. But if people are in pigeon and, there's something else, I think there are some places where it can be respectful both to yourself and to the teacher.
Mm. And I think
Um,
those of us who are teaching and we've studied some yin have a really lovely framework for that now by talking about targeted tissues. So if I'm teaching pigeon and I want people to feel a stretch or sensation wrapping around the outside of their hip or into their buttock, that's what I'm
mhm.
talking to. And if you're not feeling it there and you're feeling it in your knee or you're feeling it in your sacrum, there's another option of this pose that allows you to achieve exactly the same aim with a different shape of the body. And maybe that's a supine figure four or something along those lines. But clarity of intention, I think, is really important. And not
Mm,
just when we're teaching, but in our own practice. So maybe if you just want to really chill and find somewhere that you can relax, pigeon is perfect for you. And if you want
yeah.
to, challenge yourself a little bit more, maybe you do Supta Virasana, but not push your range of motion. So I don't want to leave people with the feeling that you should never do the things that feel good and you should only do the things that feel bad. No, get curious. What's your intention and shape your practice accordingly.
Well, and let's clarify, not necessarily feel bad, like pain, but that are challenging.
Yes,
I think
exactly.
it's a shift in mindset to embrace what's challenging, and welcome it. To
Mm,
welcome it as a way to collect more information, to collect more support, to collect more mobility. And again, it's not that I would never do pigeon. I mean, I can appreciate it more now because it feels different than when I used to do it.
mm,
Um, it's not that these poses, in my opinion, are inherently bad or wrong. And, I think a lot of it does come back to a lot of the principles of yoga philosophy. We get kind of greedy, right? We start to focus on more and more and more. There's a
mm.
contentment, there's a nonviolence, there's a truthfulness. And what do I actually need here? Is
And
this
this
going to
svadhyaya, this self study too of what am I actually feeling and what is my intention in creating this shape and what's it bringing to me and that curiosity again.
I love that word. Curiosity. It's kind of like that little key to unlock and dismantle all the judgment and all the
Mhm.
coulds and shoulds and supposed to, so that we can really be present in the experience. That there's not always, science and research can tell us all these things, but
Mhm.
until we try it on for size in our body and really feel what resonates with us, we don't know. And a lot of the long-term studies on, like I said before, on really extreme ranges of motion, yes, there is probably some correlation between having extreme range of motion, especially just in one orientation, especially when there's not active control of it, having extreme range of motion and probably having maybe an earlier onset of osteoarthritis or maybe more osteoarthritis. There's a lot of gray area there. I think there's enough that we can probably assume that more is not necessarily better. For
Mm.
me, it's not a fear thing though, because there's plenty of people who have great range of motion, that have great hips and joints for long periods of time. And there's, I think, always more to the equation. How we eat, our emotions, our
And you
our
talked about the
internal
placebo
health.
effect too. Our perception of our range of motion is probably important too.
Yeah.
Like if you're lying in pigeon thinking, oh my God, what am I doing to my labrum here? Oh, shit, probably not a
Oh
good
no.
thing.
Yes, I agree. So I think, we can clearly say that mobility deficits are associated probably with pain and functional limitations, and probably extremes are probably also, there's a lot more gray area there that we don't
Mm,
know because we don't
mm,
have a lot of long-term studies on that, on people with extreme ranges of motion. Um, but we do know that there's clearly a difference between active and passive range of motion. That that gap is a significant feature, and I would just say, to sum it all up, I think in my experience, which I think is also equally important, your experience, my experience, our experiences, both as teachers and as students ourselves, working with thousands of orthopedic patients and yoga students and teachers. I would say, from my experience, just as an observer, um, my vision of it is that more range of motion isn't necessarily better. That being able to lay on the floor, I've seen a lot of people who have super mobile hips that are in a lot of pain.
mm.
Like contortionists are a good example of that. They're some of the most They tend to be people who have a lot of pain and aches and discomfort in their bodies. And so, more isn't necessarily better. Do I need to be in a certain range of motion of a pose for it to be helpful? Hopefully by now you've sensing maybe not. Is putting my foot behind my head helpful? I'll say definitely not. I will definitely attest to that from observation too. That one's kind of notorious for SI joint issues and lower back issues. Some of those really extreme ranges of motion. Not that, again, everyone who does foot behind the head is going to hurt their back or have an SI joint problem, but we are changing things in this system, right? And how often am I walking around with my legs behind? Well, I'm not walking around.
That's what I was going to say. Hopping, maybe.
Maybe hopping. But wait, what is it preparing me for?
Yeah. I guess that's where I would want to leave people, of living in that gray area in the middle between too much and not enough, and really exploring and investigating where are there big differences in your range of motion. Where are you close to that average range and where are you really different? And investigating how and why and what happens if you, and what does it feel like if you, that curiosity, looking at the gaps between active and passive range of motion. And again, being curious there, where are there bigger differences? How do you feel? How could you bridge that gap? And just using hip mobility less as an end goal and more as just something to explore to help you get to know yourself a little bit better, not just in the context of your yoga practice, but in how you use these incredible joints to carry you through your life. What challenges are you coming up against in your daily life that you don't feel you're prepared for? And maybe you could use your practice to help address those.
Yeah, I think, it all of times come back to that contentment in our practice, our ability to be content and not constantly seeking more. There's a place for all of these. And I know for me back in my 20s, foot behind the head felt a lot different than it did now. So maybe there's a place for different times in our life. I don't want to say that I want to throw poses out completely because I think there's a place for everything and it really has to be taken in context. But sometimes I think it's this practice of we hear a lot about in yoga of letting go of our ego, which is sometimes a big fixation with these glamorous yoga poses, where we're going deep into some of this hip mobility, and to just maybe plant a seed for you here that maybe, as far as it relates to your subjective experience in your life and your functional experience in your life, will those things actually serve you? And is it important? Or can I just relax into the pose? And we'll talk later on another episode about some of the other benefits to some of these static stretches, but can I just relax and be happy with whatever shows up, the curiosity? Is it a sensation? Is it a ruminating mind? Is it contentment? Like, what am I working with today? Which isn't necessarily just the angles and the shapes.
I think that's a beautiful place to leave it. I love it. You've encapsulated a lot about what I love about yoga practice right there.
Yes. And finding a new relationship with your poses every time you're on the mat, because it is changing, whether you've gone for a run that day or whether you've been sedentary all week.
How hydrated you are, your hormones.
Yeah, what you've been
everything.
eating. I know with the holidays, it's all influencing it. So, maybe the next time you come to your mat, there's just an appreciation and an awe for your body's capacity to support and be resilient and to investigate and get curious to what is most helpful for you. And can you really chew on and, taste the nuances of that and allow yourself to really appreciate the challenges as something that might potentially be helpful. Well.
When you talk about educating the fibroblasts, which I'm now visualizing as sort of little intelligent nanobites in the body, what do you want to teach them? What do you want them to prepare you for?
I love that. And for those of you interested in diving deeper into this incredible joint and learning more about it, we have our full-length hip teacher training now all online, 55 hours. We go into a lot of details. Rachel co-teaches it with me. We talk all about the structure and function of the hip joint and the anatomy, all of the subtleties of the different parts of the anatomy that support and move this joint. We talk about range of motion in depth and a lot more detail on all the things we talked about today.
Including lots of the niggly little questions that would have popped up in people's minds as they were listening, quite possibly.
Yes. It's our kind of big overhaul of looking at this joint, not only being able to assess it and take people through an evaluation, which we kind of talked a little bit about, but then also looking at a therapeutic approach from a yoga perspective, common injuries, functional training, as well as injury prevention and durability training. There's so much information in there. So if you're a teacher and you want more information, we have plenty more for you. And I'm sure at some point soon we'll also be offering it maybe in person again.
Oh, so imagine.
Oh, I feel like that took us off into so many other areas that we
multiple episodes to come. Watch this space.
More to come. But hopefully that gets you thinking a little bit about your hips and this beautiful, powerful, supportive joint that carries us through our days. And I think is such a big part of our quality of life. Our pelvis and our hip joints, and obviously our lower back is kind of tied into that as well. Such a powerful part of navigating our experience in the world and how we also relate to other people based on how we feel in our bodies. So I welcome you to explore and experiment and find what works for you, and enjoy a little bit of exploration on your mat. Well, that wraps up for today. We look forward to you joining us for the next one.
Maybe on Yin.
Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you like the show, please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com, or check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine. You can also email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being a part of our Yoga Medicine community. We look forward to seeing you again. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.